In this lecture, we're going to pick up where we left off in our last lecture, where we noticed Luther's Reformation breakthrough and his new understanding of the gospel. And in this lecture, we're going to carry it forward into the Reformation itself. How did the gospel message launch Luther and propel him into a controversy with the Catholic Church that eventually led to the rise of the Protestant Reformation? And as with Luther's Reformation, when we talk about his breakthrough, so also when we talk about his Reformation and his fight with the Catholic Church, there's a great deal of familiarity here. Just about everybody knows that Luther nailed 95 Theses to the door of the church at Wittenberg, and that with that hammer stroke into the door, there sounded a gong, as we say, that launched the Protestant Reformation. Unfortunately, there's a lot of myth-making here. There's a lot of sort of embellishing of the story. There's so much that is in play here that too often it becomes a bit of a cartoonish caricature of the reality of what happened in Luther's day. As we'll see in this lecture, Luther actually, in a way, stumbled and bumbled his way towards the Reformation. He didn't set out to start a controversy that would lead to 500 years of Protestantism, though, of course, once it got underway, he was certainly in favor of leaving the Catholic Church. Well, what happened? Well, in a manner of speaking, St. Peter's Basilica happened. If you were to go to Rome today, down to the heart of the old world, and you were then to cross over the river, you would be very close to the Vatican. And if you approach it on foot, you will always be struck by just how impressive it is. And it's not just the history and the art and all of the heritage that is within it, but it's also just simply the size of it. The dome, designed by Michelangelo, is one of the most impressive domes still standing today. You go inside, it is just simply a marvel. If you take the tour, you get to see things like Michelangelo's works and frescoes there on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. You get to see the art of Raphael and just a number of others. Again, in terms of scope and importance of all of these pieces, both in the architecture of the building and in the art and the legacy that is curated within it, within its museums and within its archives, is second to none, really. Well, it would surprise most people to know that this isn't the original St. Peter's. Most people can notice that when you do the dating of the Roman numerals on the outside of it, the Pope who was able to put his name on it was the Pope who finished the cathedral. Just goes to show that those who finish things will often get to put their name on it, despite all those who went before them. But the Roman numerals just on the facade tell us that St. Peter's is from a later date. Even the fact that I just told you that Michelangelo was the designer of the dome itself should tell you that it comes from after the Renaissance. Well, there was before a basilica there, a much smaller basilica, by the name of Old St. Peter's. And Old St. Peter's had been established and founded and built by none other than Constantine himself, back in the 4th century. Constantine had laid over with dirt a 1st century Christian graveyard and had built a hallowed basilica there, and it had been called St. Peter's. Well, during the Renaissance papacy, as it's called, a number of the popes became unhappy with the dilapidation and the squalor that a number of the churches there in Rome lived in. And in particular, Old St. Peter's was beginning to fall apart. It had a wooden-based structure, and though obviously we don't have any pictures of it, we are told that it was leaning at one point, the walls were no longer true and plumb, and so there was the call for a new St. Peter's to be built, one that would rival any church in Christendom. And the Pope at the time was Clement VII. Well, the problem, though, is that Clement did not have the funds within his own resources to design and build a basilica that would meet the standard that he wanted. Well, over the Alps, in the city of Mainz, there was another archbishop. Now, the Archbishop of Mainz is a vitally important bishop and a seat of power in the 16th century and long after. The Archbishop of Mainz was one of the 7 electors of the Holy Roman Empire, which means that whenever there was a vacancy in the Holy Roman Empire, whenever the previous emperor had died, these 7 electors came together and elected the new emperor. So the Archbishopric of Mainz was a very, very important office. Well, the man who held the office at this point, the current archbishop, had actually gotten a hold of this office through the practice of simony, through the practice of buying and selling of church offices. He was from a very important family, the Hohenzollern family, which has a long legacy that runs all the way down until the era of Napoleon and beyond. Well, this man had bought the office, And so he, too, was in very much debt and needed a revenue stream in order to make up the amount of money that he had borrowed to secure this archbishopric. Well, the two of these men conspire, Clement VII, the Pope, and the Archbishop of Mainz, to offer an indulgence sale throughout the area of Germany. This is led principally by the Archbishop, who says to the Pope, let's have an indulgence sale in my kingdom, in my area of the world, the Holy Roman Empire, and if you bless it, we'll do it. And the two men agree to split the profits. Clement then having a revenue stream to go ahead with the refounding of St. Peter's, and the Archbishop of Mainz then having a revenue stream to be able to pay for his loan for the securing of his office. Now, by and large, no one knew of this deal until a great time after. This is something we know about in terms of hindsight being 2020. This is not something that was broadcast. Now, an indulgence sale is a very important thing, and we have to understand what is going on here. Too often it's said that selling of indulgences is the selling of salvation itself. That's a real big misstep. Indulgences are still offered today. They're not sold today. That issue is rectified shortly after the Reformation. But indulgences are part and parcel to the Catholic system. In our last lecture, we looked at how the cycle of the Christian life works in the medieval Catholic way, where you are born, you then enter into the state of grace. Then, after sin, you have to confess it, hear the absolution from the priest, and then perform a certain amount of penance. Well, an indulgence doesn't negate the reality that one has to confess sins, or feel sorry for sins, or seek their emendation in one's life. Rather, an indulgence has a very specific and a very particular purpose. An indulgence lifts the demand for penance to be performed in order for someone to be restored to the state of grace. Now, the logic here is not that you're buying it per se. These are considered to be alms. Now, again, an alm is anything above and beyond a tithe, and the giving of alms is a good work. And so what would happen in the Middle Ages is a number of people would come and confess, and they would be told, well, you need to do X amount of penance. And the person would say, I simply don't have the time or the capacity to do all of these things. And there's lots of reasons why they might say this. Well, what the church would then offer is an indulgence. Essentially what you're doing is you're funding the church's good work. You're paying for others to live the life of prayer and confession and penance, namely the clergy. It's still considered a good work. It's still considered to be a good act. It's not buying and selling of things in terms of the way we might buy and sell lunch or dinner at a restaurant. Still, though, the system is ripe for abuse. The boundary lines, the brake pedals that would stop people from abusing the system and essentially making it as if you were buying a way out of penance, were not as present as they ought to have been. Similarly, it was often not very clear, at least to the laity, where the buying of indulgences to get out of purgatory began and where buying one's salvation ended. Now, again, the theology of it is that one is already a Christian. One is already on the journey of the Christian life. From a Protestant perspective, you might say the issue here is you're not buying your way into heaven. Rather, you're purchasing indulgences as a way of securing the fact that you are already in the church, that you don't fall away fully, etc. But again, this is ripe for abuse. And well, with the conspiring of Clement and the Archbishop of Mainz, they find their man who was going to become one of the most hated and reviled indulgence hawkers in all of church history, Johann Tetzel. Now again, Tetzel always plays the scapegoat here. He's always considered the evil man. But we need to stress here, there were a lot of indulgence sales that went on throughout the Middle Ages. There were abuses in other parts of the empire and in other parts of Europe. And there were indulgence sales and abuses in general that went on in other parts of Europe in Luther's day as well. The fact is, because Tetzel is the man that Luther goes after in particular, he often goes down as the one who abused and broke the system. But he's not. He is very effective, as we'll see here in a second, though. And Tetzel is one of these guys who takes the brake pedals off, you might say, and just simply goes for it in terms of abusing the purchasing of indulgences. And what Tetzel would do is he would travel with an entourage. And as they were coming to a village or to a city, a front man, a sort of carnival barker, would go out before them into the city. And he would call throughout the city, and he would post placards and all these kinds of things, declaring that an indulgence sale was coming to their midst and calling for them to be ready when the man came. Tetzel would then enter into the city or the village with a crucifix held high, sort of a beacon for people to come and to hear his sermon or his message. If a church would not let him preach in their pulpits, he would preach sometimes in the open air. And Tetzel was really good at two things. He was good at scaring people, really ginning up the rhetoric to get people to be fearful and frightened of the fear of purgatory. He was also, by the way, good at sloganizing this. And so Tetzel would preach a sermon, these sort of fire and brimstone messages where you would hear the screams of your dead relatives in purgatory. And then he would offer the sale of the indulgence itself. And the slogans he would use are somewhat numerous, but the famous one is that, quote, "As soon as a coin in the coffer springs, a soul from purgatory springs." And we know of this in particular because Luther actually does cite this in his 95 Theses. This is one of the things that Luther considers to be so condemnatory of this particular sale of indulgences. Well, there's one last wrinkle to this that we have to note, and that is, towards the end of the Middle Ages, what began to happen is there arose this doctrine that when you purchase an indulgence, you didn't simply purchase it for yourself, but rather you could also purchase an indulgence for your dead relatives. In a still relatively feudal era where familial ties are really the core of one's identity, to hear a sermon that described the anguish of your dead relatives, and that all it took was a coin scaled to whatever your personal net worth was to get them out of this, well, as you can imagine, it was pretty lucrative. So people would buy indulgences for themselves or for their relatives who had passed on. We still, by the way, in museums and in archives and things, have the indulgence chests where this money would be placed. And it's this sort of great big box that would be weighed down with all this filthy lucre, all the money that had been extorted, you might say, from the populace. Now, before we get to Luther, it needs to be noted, a lot of people found this to be quite unseemly, if not downright dastardly. This was considered to be extortionate, abusive behavior by those in the Catholic Church on the laity. The problem, though, is that many people blamed Tetzel. They didn't really know what was going on. Maybe they knew that the Archbishopric of Mainz had offered the indulgence sale, but a lot of people, Luther himself, as we'll see in the 95 Theses, believes that it's Tetzel who's kind of gone off the reservation. He's going his own way and trying to be a successful salesman. He has broken all the cardinal rules. So, for example, actually in Luther's home area, in the area of Wittenberg, Frederick the Wise, Frederick of Saxony, another one of these electors, another one of these high-powered people in the Holy Roman Empire, had actually barred Tetzel from coming to any of his regions. Luther, in other words, is not the only person, the lone wolf voice standing up, decrying these as abuses. Well, what happens to Luther in many ways is that he stumbles into a controversy that he never intended, and that the church seeks to make an example of somebody who's relatively unimportant theologically or in terms of the church. They want to shut people up. Well, they're not going to shut up Frederick the Wise or some of these more powerful people from criticizing the sale of indulgences. These were lucrative monies that were coming into the church, both for Mainz and for the Pope. And so Luther, in a manner of speaking, stumbles and bumbles his way into the cause of the Reformation. And we know this from Luther's own mouth. He describes his Reformation as he, stumbling around blind, reaches out to steady himself and grabs a gong and pulls the rope, sending out the call for Reformation throughout Europe. In other words, this is not a manifesto document, these 95 Theses that we're going to talk about, for a Reformation, but they soon become that in the history that follows. Well, what happens is on Halloween night, as we like to say today, October 31st, 1517, it is alleged that Luther approached the church door there at the castle church in Wittenberg and nailed 95 Theses. Now, I say alleged because we actually don't have a smoking gun here. We don't have the first document of this. We don't actually have Luther describing the night he nailed these to the door. It's actually just conjectured that he put them up the night before. They're noticed the next day, but in fact, we don't actually have a scene of Luther walking up to the door in broad daylight, banging these theses up on the door. Now, this is important because in all of the art, in all of the Hollywood representations of the 95 Theses, I mean, this is just the moment of the Reformation for most people. Here's this man walking up, pounding the 95 Theses into the door, and letting everyone know that he's not going to put up with this anymore. I do always get a chuckle in the art depictions of this. There's usually people all around him in the artistic representations of this, just sort of losing their mind, pointing at the door, looking aghast, shocked that he would say these kinds of things, etc. My other favorite that I always point out is that the size of the hammer always seems to grow over the decades. I mean, he's nailing up a small document here. He's not nailing up, a steel bracket. But the way the story tends to grow with the telling, by now, all these artistic impressions and these representations of the 95 Theses, Luther's up there apparently with a sledgehammer, banging this document up with a few small thumbtacks. But the character is always there in earnest because of the way the 95 Theses are read in the light of later events. In their actual historic moment, there actually isn't a great deal of aggression by Luther. Historians always point out, and we're going to point out now, the nailing of theses on the door or nailing of theses anywhere is not a call for a revolution or a reformation. It's an academic bulletin board, you might say. Just go to anyone's faculty office, and usually on the outside of the door, there'll be these bulletin boards. They might nail up things that they want people to notice and read, whether it's humorous or not, and they end up sort of notifying people as they pass by that this is their position. This is all Luther is really doing, and we know that because just a month before, in September, Luther actually posted 97 theses, and no one lost their mind and excommunicated him, and no one started Protestantism over that. The 97 Theses, by the way, are often described today or titled today, the Disputation Against Scholasticism. In some ways, they're a bit more rancorous, really, than the 95 Theses. And it just goes to show, again, Luther's not trying to start a fight here. He's trying to start a debate in the actual University of Wittenberg. Well, the 95 Theses attack the abuse of the sale of indulgences. It's very clear here. It's not about justification by faith. It's not about the Pope. It's really not about any of these cardinal issues of the Reformation itself. It's specifically about the sale of indulgences. One can find, if you read the 95 Theses, some are quite punchy. They talk about how the abuse of indulgences has taken people off of the focus of Christ. However, there are other theses where Luther plays the defender of the Pope's honor. He actually says that Tetzel and others are bringing the Pope's honor low, and that he is writing these theses because he hopes that people will get rid of Tetzel so that the Pope is no longer slandered. There are even, by the way, some theses that talk about the merits and the role of good works in the Christian life. So this is hardly sort of manifest destiny, here I stand, a kind of great big Luther starting a reformation. Rather, the way to probably see the 95 Theses is that Luther has had a gospel conversion. The problem, though, is he's not quite sure how this all works out in his mind. You or I probably can talk about all kinds of times in our lives where this has happened. You have a real breakthrough in your personal life, in your professional life, whatever, and it doesn't really dawn on you until a good time after just how important that change in your life is. The leaven of that idea or that breakthrough has to work its way out in all kinds of ways within your psyche and within your own frame of reference. That's really what's going on here with Luther. He's had a breakthrough, he's had a gospel conversion, you might say, and that has led him to the 95 Theses. But he's not coming at this fully formed as a Protestant. Well, if that's the case, why did the 95 Theses cause such a stir? Well, the answer is, as I've said, in part, the church wanted to make an example of him. What happened is the 95 Theses were taken down at some point shortly after their posting. And no one, by the way, took Luther on for the debate, which is either a sign that no one wanted to touch the issue of indulgences, which is unlikely, everyone liked to poke fun at Tetzel, or more likely, everyone already agreed with Luther on these points, so there was no real need for a debate. Well, the problem is, again, within a matter of weeks, the 95 Theses are taken down, and they're translated from Latin into German. And then they are printed and sent around as a broadsheet throughout all parts of Germany. In a manner of speaking, it's that action that provokes the response from the Catholic Church to the 95 Theses. It's not the posting of them themselves, it's the printing of them in the German language, which makes it obviously more accessible to those who do not read Latin, namely those who are outside of the church. But sending it around does suddenly make it seem like it's a manifesto for a challenge. Now, the problem is we don't know if Luther approved of this. It doesn't seem that he did. Still, it gets him into trouble. And Luther realizes that he is getting into trouble, and he actually writes a letter of apology, not a full apology, but he writes an explanation in that sense of an apology about what he means in the 95 Theses, and he forwards the theses and his apology to none other than the Archbishop of Mainz. And if you were ever to read the apology, you would find it actually quite uncompelling that Luther is a reformer at this point, at least not the man that we come to know much later. He's essentially saying, yeah, okay, I overstated it here a little bit. I understand why someone's mad about this, and back and forth and back and forth. Well, the Archbishop of Mainz forwards the document without really looking at it to the Pope. And as a result, Luther has stepped on a trap. The response for the 95 Theses at this point is really pretty shrill and pretty authoritarian. The Catholic Church really goes after Luther. They try to exert indirect pressure through his monastic order. They try to exert somewhat direct pressure at times, doing private interviews between Luther and a cardinal, etc. Well, at this point, Luther does begin to dig in his heels. He's a bit shocked, in fact, at how much the Catholic Church is resisting his call to end the abuse of indulgences. In his mind, he hasn't really called for all that much than to stop screwing up the system. And so he begins to really iron out and become better, you might say, at the expression of his new understanding of the gospel, and why that, he believes, being biblical, is a grounds for not doing indulgences, maybe not even at all. Well, this all comes to a head in the Leipzig Disputation, where Luther squares off against his great nemesis, Johann Eck. It's at Leipzig, frankly, where Luther finally makes his verbal break with the Catholic Church. While they're debating Eck on the issue of the 95 Theses and indulgences, Eck performs a counter move against Luther that is really masterful in terms of strategy. He takes on Luther not on the issue of indulgences, not on the issue of salvation itself, but on whether or not Luther believes the Pope can err, can be wrong. He says, if you're saying that this is what the Bible says and this is what the Church teaches, well, Luther, it sounds like what you're saying is that the Pope can be wrong when he tells you to do something. Well, it's at this disputation, the Leipzig Disputation, where Luther very famously out loud says, yes, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that if it's between the Bible and the Pope, I'm going to take the Bible. And Luther says this in a very famous phrase when Eck is pushing Luther to realize that something that he is saying is somewhat analogous or synonymous even with the teachings of Jan Hus. And Jan Hus was a man from the latter Middle Ages who had been burned at the stake for saying the Pope can be wrong and for really a lot of the same views that Luther had. And eventually Luther, pushed and cajoled, says out loud at the disputation, Ja, ich bin Hussite, which means, yes, I am a Hussite, which is a bit like going before Senator McCarthy and saying, yeah, I'm a communist. To stand in front of the theologian Eck, a man who is sort of the heresy hunter, and to say you're a Hussite is to cast your lot with a renegade group that says the Pope is wrong and we don't care. We're going to follow the Bible. That really is the final nail in the coffin for Luther. And so in 1519, in October, there arrived a bull in Wittenberg that is titled, in the translation into English, Rise Up, O Lord. And there's a bit of a confusion here, at least amongst the way this story is usually told. It's often said that this is the bull of excommunication, the official document that declares Luther to be a heretic. Actually, it's not. This October 1519 document is a document that tells Luther, answer these questions finally, or else you are officially condemned. And it gave him a number of days to do so, and Luther has to respond or else. So it is, in some ways, a bull of excommunication, but it's a bull of warning that the trigger is about to be pulled if he doesn't respond and recant. Well, Luther famously walks to the city square and burns the bull. Again, he's not burning the bull officially excommunicating him, but you might say he's burning the very questions that he's being asked to answer or to recant. And so, in January of 1520, the following year, the official bull of excommunication arrives, and Luther is now a heretic. Now, what follows after is Luther is put on trial. Now, he's not put on trial by the church. The excommunication of Luther is the final verdict by the church. The way these things usually happen in the Middle Ages is whenever someone was excommunicated for heresy, they would be first excommunicated, and then, in a manner of speaking, the Catholic Church would hand that person over to the state. And then it would be the state that would put them on trial, and if they agreed with the church's verdict, the person would then be executed. The medieval church will often believe that it has executed no one directly in this sense, that it's the state that has done all the executing. But it's a bit of a both sides of the same coin. So when Luther is now called before the emperor in 1520, he has been put on civil trial and his neck is on the line. Now being excommunicated in January of 1520, he's called to the next, what we call, imperial diet. Now, a diet in a German political system, just the same today, by the way, in many ways, is a sort of congressional meeting of all the constituencies of the princes and with the Holy Roman Emperor himself. So this is a pretty big deal going on right now. These are all the major people that run, frankly, most of Europe, with the exception of France and England. And in 1520, Luther is brought before the Diet of Worms. Worms is a city where the Diet happened to be meeting at this time, which is why Luther is summoned there. And so Luther comes, and in a very famous scene, standing before the Emperor Charles V, a man who controlled more than half of Europe, politically and in terms of muscle and might, Luther is asked to recant. He's demanded to recant. And famously, Luther says, "Here I stand, I can do no other." And he is eventually condemned. Now, Luther had been given a free conduct pass. That is, he had been given the right to return to Wittenberg, that he would be chased down, frankly, after, but that he wouldn't be hauled to the gallows immediately and executed. And so Luther is free to leave, and once he realizes that the edict condemning him was going to come down, he flees. And, surprisingly, he's kidnapped. As he's on the road heading back to Wittenberg, Frederick the Wise, the man who was in charge of Saxony, that very important prince, sent knights, sent armed men to capture Luther and to send him someplace safe, where even Frederick the Wise did not know where he had gone to. This is actually a bit of a comical moment. For a period of time, for a period of weeks and months, Charles and his entourage keep asking, "Where did Luther go?" And Frederick keeps saying, "I don't know where he went." And he means it. He doesn't really know where Luther's gone off to because he instructed his men not to tell him. Well, his men had taken Luther to the Wartburg Castle. Very famous castle, you can still go and see it today. And there, Luther really began to shed so much of what was Catholic about him. He grew a beard, which might not seem to be a big day in hipster land, but in terms of this day and age, if you're a monk, you're supposed to be clean shaven. Which, by the way, so very often when you see pictures of the reformers, there's a reason why they always look like ZZ Top. It's a bit like hippies growing out their hair. It's thumbing your nose at the man. Well, Luther grows a beard, and he begins to write some of his most important treatises on the gospel and on the Reformation from the context of the Wartburg. Not only that, but he begins to translate into German the Greek New Testament. Now, for those of you who have had Greek, you might marvel at this. Where did he have time to learn all this? Well, in part, he had a study aid. Erasmus had published the Greek New Testament not long before, and it's often believed that this was just a pure Greek New Testament. It wasn't. It was really more of an interlinear in the modern sense. Erasmus had the Greek text on one page, and on the facing page, he had supplied a new, more literal, updated Latin translation. So those focusing on the Greek could look over to the Latin, which they spoke fluently, and notice where the connections were. And so Luther translates the majority of his German New Testament there in the Wartburg, beginning the process where Luther will eventually translate the entirety of the Bible, the Luther Bible, which will have a dramatic shape on not only the German church, the Lutheran church, but on the very German language itself. From the Wartburg, Luther eventually returns to the city of Wittenberg, where he will then begin a real substantive, deep reformation of the church that will eventually become known as Lutheran. Well, in the end, Luther did stumble and bumble his way into the Reformation. It was not something he intended. But the intentions of the 95 Theses were driven by his gospel breakthrough. And therefore, when challenged, when pushed, the man who had had his breakthrough about the gospel had an opportunity finally to see where his understanding of the gospel began and where that of the medieval Catholic Church ended. And he could finally see that he and the church differed on the fundamentals of the very essence of salvation itself. And so, while the 95 Theses were not a manifesto for Reformation, in the history that followed, as Luther's Reformation kicked off, and after it got underway after his excommunication, and after his trial at the Diet of Worms, Luther becomes not just a reformer from within, but a reformer from without.